Most men in the territory measure their worth by the notches on their revolvers or the weight of the gold in their saddlebags. Me? I measure it by the silence I can pull out of a stampede and the way a wild stallion lowers its head when I hum a certain low chord. My name is Elias, and while I wear the spurs and the Stetson of a cowboy, the folks in the basin call me a whisperer. I don't drive cattle with a whip and a holler. I move them with a cedarwood flute and a pocket full of dried sweetgrass that I live on the fringes, where the scrub oak gives way to the red rock cathedrals of the Badlands. My outfit isn't a ranch with a white picket fence. It's a drifting sanctuary of the broken and the discarded. I've got a blind mule named Barnaby who can hear a rain cloud forming 50 miles away, a few three-legged goats, and a dozen horses that the big cattle barons deemed unbreakable and sent to the glue factory. I took them in, not to tame them, but to understand them. The morning sun was a pale gold coin as I sat on a limestone shelf, watching the world wake up. The air was thick with the scent of sage and impending ozone. A dry storm was brewing over the obsidian peaks. Down in the valley, I could see the dust clouds of the big three outfits. I could hear their men screaming, their whips cracking like pistol shots as they tried to force 5,000 head of panicked beef into the narrow canyons. They were fighting the land, and the land was fighting back. I pulled my flute from my vest, the wood warm and polished from years of use. I didn't play a melody. I played a vibration, a deep, grounding note that resonated with the frequency of the cooling earth. My motley herd stopped their grazing. Barnaby tilted his long ears toward me. The wild stallions I'd rescued didn't bolt. They formed a circle, their breathing slowing in rhythm with my breath. "The storm is just a conversation, boys," I whispered, though the wind was starting to howl. "Don't get to shouting back at it." As the first bolt of heat lightning scorched the sky, a rider appeared on the ridge above me. It was young Jed Miller, a boy trying too hard to be a man, his face masked in grit and his hand white-knuckled on a heavy colt. His horse was foaming at the mouth, terrified by the thunder and the boy's own frantic energy. He thought I was a thief, that anyone living out here without a brand must be stealing from his father's herd. He leveled the barrel at my chest, his voice cracking over the wind. "Where'd you put him, Elias? We're missing 20 head, and Pa says you've got a way of conjuring them off the trail." I didn't reach for a weapon. I didn't even stand up. I just kept the flute to my lips and blew a soft, descending scale. Jed's horse gave a violent shuck, nearly throwing the boy into the prickly pear. The animal's eyes were wide, showing the whites, rolling in its head like marbles in a jar. It could feel the static electricity building in its coat, the same invisible fire that makes a herd turn into a living landslide. "Lower the iron, Jed," I said, the words coming out low and steady, tucked under the wind. "Your horse isn't scared of me. He's scared of that lightning rod you're holding in your hand. Don't you tell me about my mount." Jed yelled, though his aim was wavering. Another crack of thunder shook the ground, and the sky turned a bruised, sickly green. "You're a witch or a thief, and I'm bringing you back to the ranch in chains." I didn't argue. Instead, I began to play. It wasn't the grounding note from before. It was a quick, trilling bird call of a tune, the sound of a meadowlark in the tall grass. It was a sound that didn't belong in a storm, a sound of safety and spring. The horse's ears flickered. It stopped dancing. The tension in its neck muscles began to melt, not because the storm had stopped, but because the animal had found a new point of focus. It began to mirror my breathing. "Look at him, Jed," I said, lowering the flute. "He's smarter than you are right now. He knows the storm is just the sky clearing its throat. If you don't get off that ridge, you're going to be the highest point for 5 miles when the sky decides to spit." The boy looked up, finally seeing the dark, jagged veins of electricity pulsing in the clouds directly above him. The bravado drained out of his face, leaving behind a terrified child. He holstered his gun with trembling fingers and scrambled down the slope, leading his horse by the reins. By the time he reached my limestone shelf, the sky broke. It wasn't rain that came down. It was hail, stones the size of walnuts that hissed as they hit the hot dust. I gestured to the shallow cave behind me, where my blind mule and the three-legged goats were already huddled together, warm and indifferent to the chaos. Jed followed me in, shivering, his fine leather chaps soaked through in seconds. He watched in silence as I walked among the unbreakable horses I'd gathered. I didn't use ropes. I just touched their muzzles, whispering the names I'd given them. Names like Patience, Echo, and Solitude. "How do you do it?" Jed asked, his voice small against the roar of the hail. "Pa says horses have to be broken. Says you have to show him who's boss or they'll kill you just for looking at him wrong." I sat down and began to shave a piece of cedar for a new reed. "Your pa thinks the world is a war, Jed. He thinks if he isn't winning, he's losing. But a horse isn't an enemy. It's a mirror. If you come at it with a heart full of lightning, it's going to give you a storm." We sat there for hours, the boy and the hermit, while the Badlands were hammered by the elements. For the first time in his life, Jed Miller wasn't looking for something to shoot or something to brand. He was just listening to the mountain. But as the storm began to fade, a new sound rose from the valley floor, a rhythmic, heavy thumping that wasn't thunder. It was the sound of 1,000 hooves, and it was headed straight for the box canyon below us. The ground didn't just shake, it groaned. It was a sound I'd heard in my nightmares, the rhythmic, syncopated thunder of 1,000 hooves hitting the earth in a blind, terrified unison. The storm hadn't just spooked the Miller herd. It had turned them into a single, mindless engine of destruction. They were headed for the box canyon below, a natural dead end where they'd pile up against the rock walls and crush themselves to death. "Stay here, Jet," I yelled over the roar, already moving toward the mouth of the cave. "If you value your life, do not move." I didn't take a horse. A horse is a target in a stampede, another pulse of panic to add to the fire. Instead, I grabbed my cedar flute and a heavy, oil-soaked torch I kept for emergencies. I scrambled down the limestone face, moving with a reckless speed that only comes from knowing exactly where every handhold is. That I reached the canyon floor just as the first of the steers, massive, wild-eyed longhorns, burst through the scrub brush. They were a wall of muscle and horn, and they were moving too fast to see me. I didn't run away. I ran toward them, but at an angle. I knew the old drover's trick. You don't stop a stampede from the front, you bend it from the side. But I wasn't going to use a whip or a pistol. I was going to use the frequency that I struck the torch against a flint on my belt, and the flame roared to life, casting a flickering, orange light against the red rock walls. Then, I put the flute to my lips. I didn't play a bird call this time. I played a low, droning note, a sound like a heartbeat, steady and unyielding. Historically, cowboys sang to their herds at night to drown out sudden noises that might spark a run. But in the heat of a stampede, you have to become the only thing in the world that makes sense to them. I stood my ground as the first steer charged past, its hot breath stinging my face. I moved in a slow, rhythmic windshield wiper pattern, a technique used to induce loose bunching in agitated cattle. That I kept playing that single, resonant note. It was a bridge through the chaos. One steer veered slightly to the right, then another. They were looking for a leader, and in the darkness and the rain, my torch and my song were the only things staying still. Slowly, the lead steers began to mill, turning into a tighter and tighter circle until the momentum of the herd was forced into a slow, sedate spiral. Their panicked bawling turned into a low, rhythmic lowing. The stampede was dying, not because I'd fought it, but because I'd given it a rhythm to follow. That I stood in the center of a swirling sea of 3,000 animals, the heat from their bodies rising like steam in the cold rain. I was a ghost in the middle of a storm, and for a moment, the world felt like it was made of nothing but breath and vibration. But as the dust settled, I saw the silhouettes of riders on the ridge. Miller's men had arrived, and they weren't carrying flutes. They were carrying Winchesters, and they didn't look like they were in the mood for music. The flickering orange light of my torch died down to a glowing ember as the cattle settled. 3,000 beasts stood heaving in the dark, their panic replaced by a heavy, exhausted stupor. I stood in the eye of that living hurricane, my lungs burning from the dust and the cold rain, still clutching my cedar flute. From the ridge above, the silhouettes of the Miller outfit descended like vultures. Old Man Miller led them, his face a mask of iron, flanked by riders who looked more like hired killers than cowhands. They rode into the circle of cattle, their horses' hooves splashing in the mud, until they surrounded the small patch of dirt where I stood. "Step away from my property, Elias," Miller growled, his hand resting on the holster of his peacemaker. I don't know what kind of devilry you used to steal the run out of these steers, but I know a thief when I see one. You lured him here. I saved him, Miller, I said, my voice raspy. If they'd hit that wall at a gallop, you'd be looking at a canyon full of leather and bone instead of a herd. Likely story, one of the riders spat, cocking his rifle. He's been whispering our stock away for months. My vote is we don't waste the rope. I looked at them, really looked at them. They were men who only understood the world when it was screaming or bleeding. To them, my silence was a threat. My ability to move the land without a whip was a sin they couldn't forgive. Wait. A lone rider broke from the shadows. It was Jed. He rode into the circle, his clothes still soaked, but his eyes were different. He didn't look like a boy trying to play at being a man anymore. He looked like a man who had finally seen the truth. He didn't steal anything, Pa, Jed said, his voice ringing out in the quiet canyon. He stood in front of the lead steer with nothing but a piece of wood and a flame. He did what all of us together couldn't. He calmed the storm. The elder Miller looked at his son, then at me. For a moment, the only sound was the rhythmic breathing of the cattle. I saw the conflict in the old man's eyes, the urge to crush what he couldn't control versus the pride he felt seeing his son finally stand his ground. Take your broken things and go, Elias, Miller finally said, his voice tight. But if I find you on Miller land again, I won't listen to my boys' tales. You're a ghost, and ghosts belong in the shadows. I didn't argue. I didn't thank him. I simply tucked my flute back into my vest and began the long walk back toward the red rocks. As I climbed the ridge, I looked back one last time. Jed was watching me. He didn't wave, but he wasn't reaching for his gun. Either did I return to my cave, where Barnaby and the others were waiting. I sat on the limestone shelf as the sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the Badlands in shades of violet and gold. The big three outfits would keep their brands and their fences, and they'd keep fighting the earth until it swallowed them whole. But as I put the flute to my lips and played a soft morning song, I knew the truth. They owned the dirt, but I understood the soul of the land. And in the high plains, the soul is the only thing that lasts.